You ever get this weird feeling while playing a story-driven game where everything around the protagonist is exciting, emotional, dramatic, but the protagonists themselves feel like they're just kind of there? Not bad, not good, just present. Physically in the scene, narratively on the sidelines. I had this feeling for a while and it didn't fully click until I started paying attention to how certain gacha games write their stories. And that's what I want to talk about today. Something I've started calling the useless protagonist dilemma. A growing trend in live service and gacha storytelling where the supposed main character slowly stops feeling like the main character. And for this discussion, we're going to focus on one game in particular, Honkai Star Rail, because in my opinion, it's one of the clearest example of how this problem develops, why it happens, and why it matters more than people think. I've been playing gacha games since before Genshin Impact release, even back when I didn't really know what a gacha game really was. And while I think gacha storytelling has its own strengths and weaknesses, there's something about Honkai Star Rail protagonist that genuinely baffles me. And I don't say that lightly. The absolute uselessness, for lack of a better word, of the protagonist in Star Rail is something that still confuses me. Even as I'm recording this, I'm not entirely sure what the writers are aiming for. I have a few theories, sure, but every explanation I can think of feels either unnecessary, poorly justified, or outright damaging to the story. I've gone through countless stories in my life, games, books, movies, everything in between, and I honestly can't recall another case where I had to stop and ask myself, what is the protagonist's role in this story supposed to be? And that's exactly what I want to talk about today. Now, before we dive deeper into Honkai Star Rail's specific problems, we need to establish something fundamental first. What a protagonist is actually supposed to be. A protagonist isn't just a character we control. They're not just a camera, they're not just a character who shows up the most. In a storytelling theory, across novels, films, and games, the protagonist is the character whose story is being told. This is such a basic concept that honestly I never really thought about it on a deeper level before. It always felt obvious. The protagonist is supposed to be the center of change. They're the one whose choices matter the most, the one with the greatest personal stakes in the outcome. And here's the simple test you can apply. If you remove the character from the story, and the story still mostly works, then the character wasn't actually the protagonist. And this is where things start to feel really strange with Honkai Star Rail. Because, in this case, the protagonist isn't even the character with the most screen time. Ever since Penacony, the story spends more time following other characters' point of view. And when you add all of this perspective together, they take up far more narrative space than the protagonist ever does. When you actually compare them side by side, the protagonist's presence feels surprisingly limited, not just in agency, but in sheer narrative focus. And that raises a serious question. If the protagonist isn't the center of change and isn't even the center of attention, then what role are they actually playing? And I know some people might hear this and ask a very reasonable question. If the story is still good, does it really matter who the protagonist is? If other characters are written as the central focus, why does it matter that it's not the protagonist? And on the surface, that sounds fair. After all, we do have stories where the focus shifts between characters. We have ensemble casts, we have stories told through multiple perspectives. So why is this such a big deal? The reason it matters is consistency and narrative intent. If the story is written as an ensemble story from the very beginning, where there is no single protagonist, then that's a deliberate design choice, and when it's done well, it works. But Honkai Star Rail doesn't present itself that way. From the start, the game introduces a protagonist. You name them, you control them, the story frames itself as their journey. And that creates an expectation, not an unreasonable one, that this character will be the narrative anchor. So when the story then shifts its emotional weight, its conflict, and its long-term arcs almost entirely onto other characters, you're left with a disconnect. It's not that the other characters are badly written, it's that the story tells us one thing about who matters and then writes another. And that disconnect is important because stories rely on a clear center of gravity. When the protagonist isn't the one carrying the story's core questions, stakes, or change, the narrative starts to feel unfocused. even if individual moments are well written. So yes, it does matter, not because the protagonist has to hog the spotlight, but because the story needs to know who it's actually about. And this is exactly where Honkai Star Rail starts to fall apart for me. But you don't have to take my word for any of this. Let's look at what other writers have said about Protagonist, and not just video game writers. I'm talking about people whose work and ideas shaped how stories are written across books, films, and games, and many other media. One of the earliest examples goes all the way back to Aristotle. In Poetics, Aristotle describes stories as being built around action, not setting, not spectacle, not even the theme. Action carried out by an agent, a character who causes change. If there is no clear agent driving the story forward, what you get isn't a strong narrative. It becomes episodic, a sequence of events, not a journey. Later on, writers like E.M. Forster made a very important distinction between characters who experience events and characters who cause events. Protagonists obviously belong in the second category. They aren't just there to witness the world, they aren't just there to react, they are there to move the story. Then you have modern story theorists like Robert McKee, who puts it very bluntly. The protagonist is the character with the greatest stake in the outcome. Not the most screen time, not the coolest design, not the strongest abilities, the greatest personal risk. And one example I really like, especially because he talks about world building so much, is Brandon Sanderson. Sanderson has addressed the idea that the world is the protagonist, and his stance is pretty clear. A world can be the setting, a world can be the theme, but the audience experiences the world through characters. If the character at the center doesn't have a clear arc, then the story starts to feel like a tourism instead of a journey. And that's the key point I want to emphasize here. Across centuries of storytelling, from philosophy to novels to screenwriting, the definition of a protagonist stays remarkably consistent. They are the narrative anchor, the center of change, the characters whose story this actually is. So when I say that sidelining the protagonist is a problem, this isn't just my preference, it's something that goes against some of the most fundamental principles of storytelling we've had for a long time. When you apply those definitions of a protagonist agency, stakes, and narrative centrality to gacha storytelling, two recurring failure modes start to appear. The first one is the classic faceless self-insert. This is a protagonist with no strong personality, no clear opinions, and minimal dialogue. They exist mainly so the player can project themselves into the story. The problem is that projection kills authorship. If a protagonist has no strong wants or fears, they can't meaningfully drive the story, they can't grow in a defined direction, and they can't truly clash with the world. So the story compensates by shifting all emotional weight onto side characters. The protagonist stops being the agent of change and becomes a narrative utility. Someone who enables other people's stories but rarely has one of their own. The second failure mode is more subtle and honestly worse. Here, the protagonist has a design, has lore, has dialogue, but narratively, they don't matter enough. They witness events, they help other characters resolve their arcs, they react to things happening around them, but they rarely initiate major story turns, hold the central emotional stakes, or force the world to respond to their choices. So the story becomes a sequence of other people's arcs, with the protagonist acting as emotional support. And what makes this even more frustrating is that, despite doing very little to move the story forward, the protagonist still gets dragged into every major climax. They don't initiate the plot, they don't make the key choices, they don't take meaningful risks. But the moment the final boss shows up, suddenly the game remembers, oh right, we have a protagonist, and pushes them into the spotlight whatever they earn it or not. It doesn't feel like narrative payoff, it feels like obligation, like the story is using the protagonist only when it's contractually required. At that point, the protagonist still exists, but the story no longer belongs to them. This isn't because writers are incompetent, it's structural. Gacha games constantly introduce new characters, characters are monetized, and every banner wants emotional relevance. That creates pressure to give character a spotlight, write personal arcs for each one, make every update feel emotionally meaningful. And over time, the protagonist becomes a stabilizing constant, someone who's always present but rarely allowed to change too much. And when the protagonist can change, can fail too hard, and can take up too much narrative space, the story loses its center of gravity. But here's the part that still bothers me, because even if all of that is true, it doesn't have to work that way. It's not like writing a strong protagonist automatically prevents you from writing strong side characters. We've seen plenty of stories and games that do both, where the protagonist still has a clear arc, clear stake, clear growth, and the supporting cast still gets meaningful, emotionally powerful stories. So when the explanation becomes we have to sideline the protagonist to sell other characters, that doesn't fully add up to me, because you don't have to choose one or the other. You can write a protagonist as a protagonist and still write other characters as deeply meaningful. And the fact that some stories manage this just fine is exactly why this feels less like an inevitability and more like a narrative choice. One common defense you'll hear, and this is something I've heard specifically in relation to Genshin Impact a few years back when I was still playing it, is this idea that it's not the protagonist story, it's the world story. Or more specifically, the protagonist isn't the focus, Teyvat is. I don't even remember anymore whatever this was something Hoyo said themselves directly at some point, or if it was a justification that came from the community and just stuck. But either way, it's an argument I've seen repeated for years. And from a storytelling perspective, that argument just doesn't really hold up. A world doesn't experience fear, a world doesn't grow, a world doesn't make choices. Characters do. A world can absolutely be the setting, a world can be the theme, a world can even be the focus of world building. But the audience doesn't emotionally experience a story as a world, they experience it through characters. So when someone says the world is the protagonist, what it usually translates to in practice is we don't want to fully commit to the protagonist's arc. And that's why even in Genshin Impact, where the world of Teyvat is rich, detailed, and interesting, the traveler often ends up feeling strangely detached from the narrative. The story keeps moving, the world keeps changing. Other characters get emotional arcs, but the protagonist's personal journey stays vague, delayed, and constantly deferred. To me, that doesn't feel like a deliberate narrative philosophy, it feels like a narrative compromise. Because saying the world is the protagonist doesn't actually solve the problem. It's just sidestep the responsibility of writing a clear central character arc. This is where Honkai Star Rail really starts to frustrate me. The Trailblazer isn't faceless, they have lore, they have setup, they have cosmic implications. But ask yourself some very basic protagonist questions. What do they want right now? What belief is being challenged? What are they afraid of losing? How has the story changed them recently? And those must be answered in a deep narrative sense, not only in the surface writing. If those answers are vague, that's the problem. The story keeps moving, side characters keep getting arcs, major events keep happening, but the protagonist doesn't feel like the owner of the narrative. They're present, but they're not central. And this leads to another issue that really highlights the writing problem. I genuinely have no idea how strong the protagonist actually is. Some days the Trailblazer struggles against basic mobs, the next day they're fist-fighting star-eating cosmic horrors like it's Tuesday. That kind of wild inconsistency might look cool moment to moment, but narratively it's confusing, because the protagonist's power progression is supposed to reflect their journey, their challenges, their growth. When the difficulty scale is random, the protagonist's identity becomes random too. And when everything about them feels undefined, it becomes even harder for the story to anchor itself around them. And what makes this even more frustrating is that the protagonist actually has one of the coolest setup I have ever seen in a gacha story, the Stellaron. This is a literal cosmic disaster seed, a world-eating engine, a reality-warping threat that entire factions fear, and it's implanted right inside the protagonist. That should be an enormous narrative weight. It should affect their power, their identity, their relationship, their stakes, their arc. But in practice, it barely does anything. The Stellaron doesn't meaningfully harm them, empower them, tempt them, change them, or even manifest in interesting ways outside of very controlled story moments. It's Chekhov's bomb, but nobody ever remembers to plug it in. And that's such a wasted opportunity because this kind of setup could easily define an entire protagonist journey. It could create internal conflict, external conflict, moral dilemmas, power growth, danger, mystery, everything a strong protagonist arc needs. Instead, the Stellaron ends up feeling like a fancy background wallpaper. It's a cool concept art with no narrative pulse. And that's the part that hurts the most, because this concept could have been incredible. The Stellaron could have shaped the protagonist's entire arc. It could have created moments where their power spirals out of control, moments where companions are scared of them or try to protect them, moments where the Trailblazer has to confront the fear of becoming a monster or losing themselves or being used as a weapon by forces bigger than them. It could have influenced their choices, their relationship, their identity. It could have made them dangerous or tragic or inspiring. Instead, it's just an afterthought, a dramatic premise with no dramatic follow-through. To be clear, this isn't me saying that every game needs to handle protagonists the same way. There are plenty of story-driven games that prove you can focus heavily on side characters without losing the protagonist's narrative importance. In those stories, side arcs don't replace the main character, they orbit them. No matter how large the cast gets, the protagonist's values, decisions, and personal stakes remain the core reference point. Even in ensemble-heavy stories, the narrative is honest about who the story is actually about. The problem isn't ensemble storytelling, the problem is pretending the protagonist is central while writing them as optional. Now, I want to be very clear about something. A lot of players genuinely enjoy these stories. And that makes sense. For most gacha players, the appeal isn't the protagonist arc, it's the characters they pull, the emotional moments in individual arcs, the world building, the atmosphere, and the music and spectacle. If you're attached to the side characters, the story works, even if the protagonist fades into the background. There's also the self-insert factor. Some players prefer a protagonist who stays neutral and flexible, because it makes projection easier. That's not stupid, that's not wrong, it's just a different way of engaging. And because gacha stories are consumed slowly over months or years, the lack of central protagonist arc doesn't hit immediately. It builds quietly. This isn't a classic bad writing problem. It's new. It comes from live service storytelling, long-running narratives, and monetized ensemble casts. The danger is subtle. The story doesn't crash, it slowly drifts. And the players disengage without fully knowing why. So no, this isn't just about preference. From a storytelling craft perspective, sidelining the protagonist is a real structural problem. Because when the protagonist stops being important, the story eventually loses its direction. And that's something gacha storytelling seriously needs to reckon with. I want to be clear about something before I end this video. This isn't me saying that gacha stories are doomed, it's definitely not me saying that people are wrong for enjoying them. I'm talking about this because I actually like story-driven games. I like long-running narratives, I like character-focused writing, and that's exactly why this trend worries me. When the protagonist slowly fades into the background, the story doesn't break immediately. It keeps functioning, it keeps delivering moments, it keeps introducing interesting characters. But over time, it loses something really important, a sense of personal direction. A strong protagonist gives a story continuity. They give meaning to change, they give the audience someone to grow with, not just watch things happen around. And I don't think gacha games are incapable of doing this. I think they're choosing not to, or they're afraid to commit. That's a very different problem. I don't want gacha stories to be smaller, I want them to be braver. Braver about letting the protagonist fail, braver about letting them change, braver about letting the story actually be theirs. If you disagree with me, that's fine. Honestly, I love to hear why, because this isn't a settled topic and it shouldn't be. But if you ever felt like something was missing in these stories, even when everything else seemed well written, that might be why.